Mr. Lim Tean.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a great pleasure for me to be with all of you this afternoon. I thank Gilbert once again for inviting me to speak at this event. This is my second year running speaking at a Labor Day event. And I want to tell you that it was so enlightening for me to listen to all the earlier speakers, my good friends, Hian, Mr. Tan Lian. Now, I am not a trained economist. I'm a trained lawyer. But as many of you know, I'm an opposition politician. And I come to politics with a certain philosophy of government and how government should do its job to protect the citizens. Now, when I look at the labor landscape in Singapore today, I must admit, I think it is dismal. And it is dismal primarily because of the economic framework that we have in place in this country. Now, for close to 60 years now, we have had a neoliberal government. For at least 50 of those years, I would say. This has been the most right-wing government in the world. Not a mean feat by any means, because Lee Kuan Yew and the PAP started out as a leftist political party. In his young days, he was even a member of the Fabian Society in England. But after they came to power, they became more and more right-wing. And many of you will remember when Thatcher came to power in 1979 and Reagan came to power in 1980. They started the neoliberal revolution. But actually, they were preceded by the PAP. And to understand the economic framework today in our country, we have to understand what this term neoliberalism means. Now, it is a term that has come about because of an economic school of thought that was started by an Austrian economist, Friedrich Hayek, in the late 1930s. Now, this economic school of thought has spawned many eminent economists, the most famous of which I am sure all of you have heard of, Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago. And this school of thought tells us that human beings are competitors. It urges us, all of us, to compete, encourages us to compete. And it tells us that at the end of the day, the only real value in human society is profit. Does that not sound familiar to all of us? You look at our government today. All it cares about is running a surplus, and not just a surplus, it runs an obscene surplus. This economic school measures everything, all human relationships, treats all human relationships as a consumer transaction. And at the end of the day, it tells us inequality is not a problem. Do not try and erase inequality because it will make society unproductive. It is a school of thought that tells us it is better for the government to make the rich richer so that the wealth created by them will trickle down to the rest of society. So we have this phrase, trickle-down economics. Or when it became too ugly a phrase, Reagan started calling it supply-side economics. But they're all the same. Now, has trickle-down economics really benefited any of the societies? At the end of the day, no. Because these rich people that these governments aim to create are at the end of the day not wealth creators. They are wealth extractors. They buy assets, they buy buildings, they buy businesses, and they get rich because of the rental income that they derive from these assets. And as a result, today, we have a capitalism that is corrupted and that does not reward labor. Why? Because it is in the interest of the rentier society to downplay labor, to make labor unprofitable so that their profits can increase. Mr. Kumaran Pillai talked earlier about how our trade unions have been decimated. Mr. Leong Hian talked about tripartism. Now, you find a common denominator in all rentier societies and in all neoliberal economies. The deliberate destruction of the trade unions, of the collective bargaining power of the worker. Thatcher did it. Reagan did it. Lee Kuan Yew did it. They destroyed the trade unions. And they come out with this fantastic term, tripartism, which basically means the trade union is controlled by the government. And look around us, ladies and gentlemen. Not so long ago, Lian told us, we've got to go and steal other people's lunches to survive. Now, isn't that human competition in its rawest form? All right? You have a public utility in Singapore that is so critical to our transportation, the SMRT, privatized. Now, that is another feature of neoliberal economic policies. The privatization of essential public utilities, because at the end of the day, it believes that everything must be for profit. I find it so sad that today, this rentier economy in which we live in curbs the growth of wages, and for the last 20 to 30 years, I would say that wages of workers in Singapore have stagnated. They have flatlined. They have even been reduced. When we ask the government to impose a minimum wage, they say no. This will bankrupt the economy. Companies will leave and we will have more unemployment. This is total rubbish. We are the only advanced country in the world without a minimum wage. Even China has a minimum wage. America has a minimum wage. Britain has a minimum wage. Hong Kong, Taiwan, all have minimum wages. Malaysia. In none of these countries have there been a reversal of the minimum wage policy. In fact, after the imposition of minimum wage, governments actually want to raise the minimum wage, which they have just done so in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And why is that? Because if you have a minimum wage, the other sectors of workers in the economy, they all get pushed up. Their wages correspondingly get pushed up. And so people have more money to spend, the economy blossoms and grows that way. So never believe in what this government tells you that a minimum wage will bankrupt our economy. I say total rubbish. I tell you the reason why they will not impose a minimum wage. And it is part of their neoliberal and rentier economy psychology. They want to help those owners of businesses. All right? And they want to keep wages depressed. And you know what is the outcome? The outcome then is that government, and in our case, our sovereign wealth fund, Temasek, has a cash hoard. And it uses this cash hoard to invest overseas in assets, in properties. And I read the other day the astounding fact that there is something like $800 billion of our money invested overseas. And what has happened to that Singapore worker? His wages have been depressed so that the business entities can profit, have this cash hoard to do whatever they like. And this cash hoard is not in the hands of the many. It is in the hands of the very few, the plutocrats and the elites. And as so many of you have remarked, there's absolutely no transparency, no accountability in how this money is used. You know, I found it hilarious a couple of weeks ago to hear Mr. Shanmugam suddenly talk about wanting to cut down on inequality. I mean, that must be the biggest joke, because it is precisely the PAP economic policies that have spawned inequality in our society. And I think we are one of the most unequal societies in the world today. And you know, they try to camouflage the figures. They say that because of government transfers and all that, the Gini coefficient has come down to 0.402 something. But again, that is disingenuous, because these transfers are not cash transfers. So many of it are transfers which at the end of the day do not materially affect a citizen's life. And I tell you one incredible feature of this whole neoliberal structure we have in place in our country. So they will not give us a minimum wage. But they tell us, don't worry. We have schemes like workfare for the lower wage, more aged workers. Let me tell you how workfare came about in historical times. In 1795, in an English village called Spinnerland, it's spelled Speenhamland. This was a village in Berkshire in England. Now, the rural workers there were paid very low wages, barely subsistence level, not even subsistence level. They could not survive. They wanted to migrate to other villages to look for work. But you know what the village did? It said, you don't move. I will give you a subsidy so that you are able to survive. As a result of that, the workers stayed put. Now, they were not rich. They were not even average. They barely subsisted. They barely survived. For the next 30 years, the Spinnerland system got adopted throughout England. And it became known as workfare. And so, farmers, industrialists, all got cheap labor. They were not paying their fair share of the wages. They were being subsidized by other poor people for the work that was done for them. And today, isn't that what we have in workfare? the government is telling us, look here, workers, you get paid a low amount by your employer, but we are going to subsidize you to make up so that you can survive. You know, in 1834, when they had a commission to examine this system called workfare in England, you know what the commission said it was? Termed it the universal system for pauperism, because that is what it is. And I have always criticized workfare because you are tying those poor workers to the apron strings of the government. You are not giving them the dignity of labor. You are not paying them their proper wages. So, my fellow friends, I do not offer any policies at this time to suggest how our labor market can be improved. I have spoken a lot, as you know, in the past. I have criticized our government's labor policies in allowing foreign workers to work in Singapore. We are the only advanced economy in the world that does not protect its citizens from foreign labor. No other country does the same. If you go to Australia, you go to America, you see whether you can take that job off that Australian or that American. But I'm not going to go further today, but I want to suggest to you that instead of examining policies piecemeal, we must understand the system we are in. And if we want to have a totally different framework, which will result in a brighter picture for labor, I suggest that we must do one thing. And that one thing is to change this government. Because without a change of government, you are not going to have meaningful change in the labor market at the end of the day. Because it is how government views labor which counts. So with that, I thank you very much. Thank you.